Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It is a joy to be with you. Please go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. We're streaming there. Like and subscribe, if you will, and then click the bell so that whenever we come live, you can be notified. And then, if you would, meet me on the Santita Jackson and Friends page, the Santita Jackson and Friends page. That's the only page where I can accept friends. And on X, I have to stop calling it Twitter. On X, my handle is at Santita J, at Santita J, just as we have at Ray McGovern. We're so excited to have him with us, Attorney Daryl Jones, as we've been talking about what's on the table, who's at the table, and what's on the menu for the election of 2024. And Attorney Anastasia Sanat, my sorority sister from college, although I am her elder. That's all right. I'm her sister. We are talking about what's happened in Russia. Horrific. An attack at a theater. More than 130 people have been killed, and ISIS has been assigned responsibility for this. I think we've forgotten about ISIS, just given all that's happening in the world. But I have a lot of questions. What happened in Russia? We're seeing reading reports that those who were active in this heinous act, that they were headed back to Ukraine. Kiev is saying the Kremlin is responsible. Putin is saying, we're going to have revenge. What does this mean? How is it that America was notifying them? And was America really going to be believed by the Russians? There's so many questions that I have to ask this brilliant man, indeed, political activist, and I must say a patriot. And I feel so good about this former CIA officer who worked in service of our country for decades, from 1963 to 1990. But he briefed the president in the 1980s. That's right. He was the chairman of the National Intelligence Estimates. And so he would sit with the president and prepare the CIA daily brief for the president. What an incredible experience. And yet he has come out helping to found this group, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Boy, you talk about an evolution. This man just keeps on going. I always have to check on Ray McGovern, Attorney Sanat, and Attorney Daryl Jones, and Reverend Dr. Yuri. I always have to make sure that he's not in jail somewhere, because he is always getting arrested. But really pushing our country to be, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, to be, in fact, what you said you were on paper. I don't care how you started, but this is where you're going, because the genius of our founders, and they were human. I'm not going to say they were flawed, they were human. They wrote a document and they really created a framework that really is brilliant. And that gives us a lot of space, but we have to work the system. The iconic Reverend Dr. Johnny Coleman, Reverend Yuri, as you recall, we remember her from Christ Universal Temple. She said, it works when you work it. And the system works when you work it. You were just saying in the last hour, Reverend Dr. Yuri and Attorney Daryl Jones and Attorney Sanat, the system can work. But we've got to get in and work it, because this is a very mature form of government, this republic. It requires that we get involved. And no one has been more involved, and no one has been, what did my father say that he is? He says, look, I'm a tree shaker. That's what I do. I'm the agitator. If you don't agitate, you don't get the clothes clean. And that is what Ray McGovern is. He agitates and agitates and makes us better. Thank you so much for being with us today. And indeed, I had to ask you when this happened, and everybody's been buzzing, talking about this. What happened in Russia? I mean, where did this attack come from? Where did ISIS come from? We haven't heard about them in such a long time. Who are they, in fact? Ray McGovern.
Well, thanks, Santita. It's good to be back with you again. There's still a lot of mystery around that attack, that terrible attack in Moscow. There are anomalies. ISIS has been blamed or been said to have taken the blame. But there are a lot of things that are inconsistent to ISIS fighters. They usually fight to the end. They usually shoot themselves before anybody else can catch them. They don't usually work for $5,000 a throw,
Mm.
and they don't usually try to get well, I don't want to say back to Ukraine, but they don't try to use an open envelope, so to speak, to get back into Ukraine. So there's great suspicion that the Ukrainians had something to do with this. The question, cui bono, who profits from this kind of thing? And it's a stretch, but you might reason that the Ukrainians need some way to divert attention from how they're losing to Russia in Ukraine, how the thing is lost, and would very much like the West to up the ante, perhaps by what's the word, provoking Putin to retaliate in such a way that the West is in turn embarrassed enough to send foot soldiers, for example, into Ukraine. I spent the day putting the finishing touches on a Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity memorandum, pegged exactly to the French threats, so the French advisories, that, yeah, they could put troops into Ukraine. We try to assess why and what will happen to them. And what are they trying to provoke? Are they trying to make believe they're NATO troops? And are there other NATO countries that would consider them to be the alliance troops? And when the Russians make short work of them, will that prompt them to retaliate and get us, escalatory steps? Last thing I'll say is that Obama himself, very carefully in 2015, warned that in Ukraine, Russia has, fancy word, escalatory dominance. You all know what that means, right? Look at the map, for God's sake, okay? He also said, look, the worst thing we could do for the Ukrainians would be to give them the idea that they could defeat the much stronger Russians. So that's why I'm not going to give them any lethal weapons. You have to realize, says Obama, that for Russia, Ukraine is an existential threat if it falls within NATO's orbit. For the United States, we have to be able to distinguish between existential threats, and it ain't one for us. So, what are the implications of all that? Where was Biden when all this was being put together? And what kind of advisors have misled him into thinking that it's okay to waste the flower of Ukrainian youth on the battlefield in a war they can't win?
What has been the point of Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine is simply a pawn in this whole business. The U.S. desires that NATO expand, despite promises not to expand NATO, all the way along the Russian border. They started that shortly after James Baker, Secretary of State for President George H.W. Bush, promised not to move Ukraine, not to move NATO 1 inch to the east. And why did he promise that? Because his quid for that quo was very, very sensitive for the Russians. He appeared in February of 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when things started to fall apart in Eastern Europe. And he, sent by George H.W. Bush, talked to not only Shevardnadze, his opposite number, but to Gorbachev, okay? And he said, here's the deal. He was a Texas lawyer, and he still is. So here's the deal. We would like to have a reunited Germany. Now, the whole notion of NATO was to keep the Americans in Europe, keep the Russians out of Europe, and keep the Germans down. That was explicated by the first Secretary General of NATO. That's exactly what he said. We want to keep the Germans down so they don't do what they did before. Okay. Well, that worked for a while. But then, before that was agreed on, the Germans wreaked havoc with the Russians to the tune of, would you believe it, 26 plus million Russians, Soviets killed in World War II.
Hmm.
By comparison, our numbers are about 420,000. Okay. 26 million. Okay. So I'm just setting the stage here. Here's Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. Now, they were about my age, really, and they lived through World War II as I did as a young boy, and they knew it had happened. And so here is a bright young Secretary of State from the U.S. saying, "Hey, we'd like a reunited Germany." Now, when I first heard that rumor that was going around even before Baker went there, I was maybe I saw too many World War II movies or something, but you can imagine how they reacted to that. Long story short, they said, "My God, that's a very, very big quid. What's the quo?" And Baker then said, and it's very clear in the documents and the memoirs. He said, "Well, now how would it be if how would it be if we promised not to move NATO 1 inch to the east of the present East German border? How would that be?" And Gorbachev, Shevardnadze said, "Well, let's just think about it." They came back the next day and said, "Well, you promise not to expand NATO? Cross my heart, hope to die," says Bill Baker. Not Bill Baker, but James Baker. Bill Baker, different guy. Same accent, maybe. Anyhow, so that's the way it all went down. And shortly after that, Clinton came in. I hate to say it was Clinton, but it was. He said, "Well, that wasn't written down, right?" Well, promises don't have to be written down among responsible people, among honest people. So they ran Rutschaf. They expanded NATO 100%. It was 13 at the time. It got up to 26. That's 100%. And then in 2008, they said, "Well, now we're going to get Ukraine." Now, I know this is the way it went down. I had just retired, but this is the way it went down. Okay. Cheney and Bush said, "Hey, what else can we do before we go out into the western sunset?" And they said, "Oh, hey, Ukraine, that would make us really. Let's let's see what we can do. Let's see what we do to make things a little better and expand NATO." So, long story short, at the summit in Bucharest, April 2008, they forced through a decision against the reluctance of the British and the French and other people who knew which end is up. Ukraine and Georgia, the country of Georgia, will become members of NATO. Okay. Oh, wow. Now, how the Russians react to that? Well, they said, "That's it. That's it." And our ambassador, whose name is William Burns, and who had been ambassador in Russia, and now he's head of the CIA, sent a cable back saying, "Look, everyone from the knuckle draggers in the bottom of the Kremlin to the highest officials had a neuralgic reaction to that. They see that as a red line, and indeed, the copy of his cable, we have the cable thanks to WikiLeaks. Okay, the subject line said, "Niet means niet." Russia's red lines on admission of Ukraine to NATO. Well, so he played it straight. Then, what his opposite number there, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, told him was, "Look, if you insist on taking over Ukraine as part of NATO, we will be faced with a decision we don't want to face, and that is there'll be civil war there, and we Russians will have to decide whether we have to intervene or not. Don't do it. It's a red line. Understand?" Well, Cheney was running things in those days. Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, William Burns' nominal boss, said, "Well, we do it anyway." And so they did. And then later, even worse, uh, Victoria Nuland, who just left her office, inspired a coup, orchestrated a coup in Kiev on the 22nd of February 2014. And if anyone has any doubts about who orchestrated that coup, yeah, there is a tape recording of Victoria Nuland talking to the U.S. ambassador in Kiev on an open line, telling who's going to be the new prime minister and how Vice President Biden was going to come in as an international personality to glue the deal when this whole thing goes. And it goes down. And the eerie thing about it was this tape of this conversation about this impending coup was published in YouTube on the 4th of March. I'm sorry, the 4th of February, 2014. I said to myself, yeah, that's what we call it's blown. The coup is blown. That's the trade word. It's not going to happen. Well, I guess Putin felt the same way because he stayed in Sochi for the Winter Olympics, didn't come back until the day after the coup. So when it is called the most blatant coup in history, I don't know of any others that have been advertised on YouTube 2.5 weeks before the coup happens. And that's where it all started. It went down from there, but perhaps I should stop here and give you a chance to get a word in edgewise.
No, I mean, because I think the background of Reverend Dr. Yuri and Attorney Jones and Attorney Sinat, I think all of this is very important because it helps, because we need context for what's happening, not just what has happened over in Russia, but what's happening right now. Because it seems that everyone is on pins and needles waiting to see if President Putin is going to react. And ultimately, are we going to head into World War III? I even heard talk of that this morning on television.
Well, those are the questions. And so let me continue where I'll pick up where I left off pretty much. The coup happened in 2014. The head of the CIA and others went to Kiev and said, okay, we're going to support you 100%. So if you have these people that don't want to acquiesce in your seizure of power, we'll arm you and we'll make sure you prevail over them. Where were those people?
Ray
Those
McGovern,
people were
sure. Could we establish that the coup that America held to overthrow a democratically elected government, right?
Oh my goodness. Yes, they do. Yeah.
I just think it's important to note.
I didn't
The
really hear
United
you
States
exactly.
seems to be doing that all over the world. They always put their influence in.
In 2014, we helped to overthrow their democratically elected government.
That's correct. Yeah, it's exactly correct, and it's on YouTube, as I say. That the puppeteers were intercepted planning the coup. Coup started 2 weeks later, and the duly elected president. The UN monitored that election. His name was Yanukovych. He had to flee for his life. Okay, there had been a deal worked out between the French and the Germans and the Poles. Look, Yanukovych, if you have early elections, nobody likes you, least of all us. Look, you could stay in power to the early elections, but that night it all broke loose, and those who were inciting these armed insurrections against the police and everything else, we know that these shooters at the top of those apartment buildings were shooting at both sides, the police and the protesters, to stir up this violence. So what happened then was the people in Crimea, who are primarily Russian stock and who have been there since the days of Catherine the Great, they decided they really didn't want to submit to these coup plotters, these coup officials now. And so they said, well, we're going to petition, maybe the Russians will annex us, okay? Now, the big deal with respect to Crimea is that it contains Russia's only all-year-round naval port. It's called Sevastopol, and it's been there, as I say, since Catherine the Great. It performed heroically during World War II. Upwards of a million people fell trying to defend that from the Nazis. Anyhow, Putin called the Council of War the day after the coup and said, "What are we going to do about Crimea?" Well, they keep asking, "Please take us back." What do you mean, take us back? Well, Crimea used to be part of Russia, not of the Ukraine. Huh? Well, how'd that happen? Well, when Khrushchev came in after Stalin died, he needed all the support he could manage. He lived right on the border of Ukraine. He had lots of Ukrainian friends. He said, one thing I could do to enhance my political power would be, yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we give Crimea to Ukraine? Now, did that matter? It didn't matter a whit. Why? Because Ukraine was part of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it didn't matter anything. So Putin says, well, how did Khrushchev do this? Well, he took a piece of paper, right, and a pen, and he wrote out ukaz. He said, okay, Crimea will now be part of Russia, not Ukraine. Oh, so that's what happened. And of course, some of his generals will probably say, we ought to do the same thing. And that's not Putin's style, right? He took legal courses. He's pretty much a lawyer. He says, now let's, how do the people of Crimea feel? They want to be reunited. Well, let's have a plebiscite. That's what happened. The plebiscite registered over 90% of the people wanted Russia to re-annex Crimea. And that's what happened shortly after the coup. Then there was this problem of these people in the Russian stock places of the Donbass. There were two oblasts there, Donetsk and Luhansk, and they didn't want any part of this new coup government. And when the coup government went against them with arms, they resisted with arms. Long story short, it became so violent and really so brutal that there were talks in Minsk in Belarus, and agreements were reached. The last one in 2015. Look, let's not kill each other. Okay, let's have a ceasefire and let's work out a deal where Lugansk and Donetsk can get a measure of autonomy within the Ukrainian configuration. They have to change the constitution, but let's do that. Now, the people of Donetsk and Lugansk knew that this was never going to happen under the Ukrainian government. So they said to Putin, please, you did it for Crimean. Please, take us back, take us, please. And he said, no, we're going to do this. And long story short, France and Germany played Putin for a fool. He now confesses openly that he was naive in trusting them. They just wanted time to build up the Ukrainian army so that it would be strong enough to resist the Russians or whatever, and take over Donetsk and Lugansk. Fast forward to 2022, they were enhancing the shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk by a factor of 10 in mid-February. On February 24th, Putin sent his forces into that part of Ukraine. Why? Did he want to take all of Ukraine? No, there's no way that he possibly do that with the number of forces he put in there. What do you want to do? He wanted to give Zelensky the fear of God and say, hey, let's negotiate, because we don't want our people in Donetsk and Lugansk to be shot by artillery day after day. They met and they agreed, okay? Mark my words, April 2022, 6 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, there was an agreement. There would be a ceasefire. Ukraine would remain neutral. There would be a separation of forces. Crimea and the Donbass would be talked about later, but there'd be a ceasefire and we'd deal. Guess what happened? The US and the UK put the kibosh on that deal. It's very clear now. We knew this is what happened, but now we have the German Chancellor Merkel at the time the French president Hollande at the time, Poroshenko, who was president of Ukraine at the time, and Zelensky, all admitting that, yeah, that's what happened. The U.S. and the U.K. told us, no, don't do this deal. We'll give you all the support for as long as you want. If you refuse this deal, we'll give you the arms to prevail, okay? Not only that, one of the negotiators, Crimea is his name, he's not a sort of dissident. He's head of the faction in Zelensky's parliament, for God's sake. He's a close associate of Zelensky. He was the lead negotiator in Belarus and then in Turkey. And he came out and he said, yeah, that's exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. We had this deal. I initialed it. And the US and the UK said, no, you better turn that down or else we won't support you. If you turn it down, we'll support you for as long as it takes. Now, that was pretty cynical. For as long as it takes is about over now, because Obama was right in the first place. There's no way that Russia is going not to prevail in Ukraine, partly because it's an existential threat if NATO takes over Ukraine. And the Russian forces are much stronger. The notion that the president himself, that is President Biden, spread around last July, that Putin has already lost. He suffered a strategic defeat. I don't know where Biden got that, but it was terribly wrong. And now they have to deal with the fact that inevitably, and I say that word advisedly, inevitably, Russia's going to win unless, and the big unless is, one side resorts to using small nuclear weapons. Now, which side would that be? It wouldn't be the Russian. They don't need to. They are prevailing. They can, as the status of forces exists now, they could go to the Dnieper River in about 3 weeks and just sit there on the east bank of the Dnieper River. They don't need any nuclear weapons. Who might use them? This is my fear. Okay.
Mr. McGovern, this is Anastasi Senat, attorney Anastasi Senat. Our biggest concern here in the United States happens to be not only with the funding of the Ukrainian-Russian war, but also whether or not this would cause us to create a World War III. Is this something that you see happening either with the election of Biden or with the election of Trump? Do you think one is more prone to go into a World War III where we're sending our people into the actual fray of this war?
Really good question. When I think about the choice between Trump and Biden, and this is my personal opinion, it's what the Germans call eine Wahl zwischen it's a choice between pestilence and famine or something like that. It's two choices.
Right.
Pest und cholera. It's pest being pestilence or famine, and cholera, you know what cholera is. So it just is impossible for me to say what Trump would do. He's totally unpredictable. Biden, well, Putin says that Biden is predictable, but I don't think Putin says that in a flattering sort of way. You know, right after Bush called him an SOB, Putin was interviewed, and he said, "Well, you know, that's what I said, predictable. You know, that we prefer people who show their cards, predictable." Okay, and that's to your question, Anastasia, and I'm really glad that you asked it. That's what I fear too. And you know, when you look at nuclear weapons, they were used just once, thank God. We have been incredibly lucky that they have not been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they're there, and they're more modern, and they're smaller yield, if you will, and so forth. They can be used, some generals think, on the battlefield and not end up with us destroying one another. That's a big myth, in my view. Even, well, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev said a nuclear war cannot be won It should never be fought. So let's look at the practicalities here, okay? Here's one scenario. George, uh, Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, Jacob Sullivan are all prosecutable under crimes like bribery and other things that will undoubtedly come out if the other guy wins. Okay. What am I saying here? I'm saying that's not just Hunter, it's Daddy. They have the goods on him, okay? And who started Russiagate? That big legend? That was Jacob Sullivan. And who rallied 51 intelligence directors to say that Hunter's laptop was a Russian disinformation operation? That was Tony Blinken. We have sworn testimony to that effect. So here these guys looking at this situation. Do they care much about anything else but themselves? I don't think so. Would they be willing to risk nuclear war to make sure that Ukraine wasn't lost until after November, so that they wouldn't lose in the election and perhaps even lose their freedom? I wouldn't put it past them. So that's what really scares me. We're up against the wall here, right? And Joe Biden wakes up and he says, well, now, is there no way? Is there no way we can halt the Russians? Is there no way we can teach them a lesson and not lose before the election? Well, Mr. President, yeah, there is a way. And that's true. There is a way. And what would that way be? We use a little of these low-yield weapons to scare the hell out of the Russians. That would do it. That would take us through November for the election. Would these guys do that? I don't know, but I find just asking myself that question in a serious way puts the hair back up on the back of my neck here. It's possible. So if there's a nuclear exchange, it'll be in Europe first. And if these French troops, this is the other scenario, let's say the French troops go into Ukraine as Macron has threatened, okay? 2,000 of them, maybe supplemented with some of the troops from the Baltic states. The Russian leaders have already said these will become targets, and I have no doubt that they will be shot up, okay? I have no doubt that they will be destroyed. Now, what would that mean? Well, will the French and other people in Europe say, oh, wait a second, those are NATO troops. Now we have to invoke Article 5 because the French are getting shot up by the Russians. Well, that's why we wrote this memo. It's just published now 5 minutes ago on consortiumnews.com. It's to warn the president, look, you need to make it very clear that if the French go off and do this crazy thing, they are not doing that as part of NATO, okay? And NATO will not retaliate for what happens to the French troops that go in there. Please, Mr. President, listen to us this time. You haven't listened to any of our other memos, and you could see the results of your having been diddled in thinking you could win this war against Russia. So this is the more immediate scenario, where if the French go in there, even with the Baltic troops, will the Russians shoot them up? Well, who is it that said they're already targets if they do that? I think it was Peskov, the PR guy for Putin. That's big. I mean, that's a warning. Would they be shot up? I think the chances are higher that even though Putin's a pretty measured guy, and he might just, they're not going to make any difference, for God's sake. So there's a countervailing argument that you just wait and pick them off one by one and not make a big thing out of it. God knows what he'd do.
Well, you say he's a measured guy. That is not how he's portrayed by the West.
That's quite right. This is at the heart of things. Putin has horns on him. He's called Hitler and the devil, and he's not those things at all. Putin took charge in Russia at a time when it was on its back. Not only had the Soviet Union fall apart, not only had it lost several of its republics, and in those republics were millions of Russian citizens that you know, had no protection anymore. Not only that, but during the 1990s, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the falling apart of the Soviet Union, Russian industry, Russian natural resources were plundered by oligarchs from east and west. The Wall Street boys, the guys from the banks, they were going to show the Russians how to make sure that capitalism was imported and that this would just be great. Now, one token of how this went down is a World Bank figure. Okay, now Yeltsin during Yeltsin's years, let's say the 90s, we helped him get reelected in 96. So between 1991 and 1995, the average mortality rate for a Russian male went from age 63 to 57. Do the math. 5 years. People were dying on the street. There was hunger galore. Their natural resources had been exploited. Lots of oligarchs got very rich. A lot of them went to London or New York. And the country was in shambles. And Putin took over. What did he do? Well, long story short, he put Russia back on its feet. He is immensely popular for having done so. And in the meantime, he has built up Russia's army and its armed forces in a way that not only are they a formidable foe to the United States, a conceivable foe, but that they exceed U.S. capabilities in certain really important areas, like how fast missiles fly. And some of us were young. We remember Mach 1? Oh, man, Mach 1, that was the speed of sound. Boom, you can hear it, Would you believe
Mr. McGovern,
now? Yeah.
Mr. McGovern, I have another question. This is
Yeah,
Anastasia Sanat talking
sure.
again.
No
My
problem.
question is, given that we are coming up on the November 2024 election that seems to be a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, Russia and Ukraine has taken over the airwaves. But a lot of people are under the impression, as I am, that the swing vote will come from the Black community, in that if we don't vote in favor of one or the other, that person will end up in office. So why would Russia and Ukraine in that situation over there in Eastern Europe be in any way, shape, or form important to the Black people here in the United States? Why should we vote one up or one down, or why should we care besides our taxpayer dollars going to Ukraine? Why should we care as a Black community about what's going on over there? What's so important about that?
Well, from a human point of view, we should care about 500,000 Ukrainian youth, men being dead. Okay.
And that's the same thing that's happening in Gaza. I mean, there are tons of women and children that obviously are not part of Hamas that have been killed.
Yeah.
So genocide is definitely something that we're asking for ceasefire in. But
sure,
going back to Russia and Ukraine, besides the humanitarian factor, what specifically should Black people be thinking about when it comes to who they should select as president and why? Because I don't see a correlation between what's going on in Russia and Ukraine as to what's going on with the Black American agenda.
Yeah, I'm flummoxed because I have no good answer to that. I have no good answer to what white people or yellow people or Hispanics should be thinking
that would
about.
be my question. I mean, because we keep pivoting around Ukraine and Israel. Mm-hmm. What is the deal here? Because there's something going on, and it's above my pay grade, clearly. What are we missing? Because our budget has been held up over this. And then you've had the president who snuck around money over to Ukraine and snuck around money over to Israel. And It's just, I'm just trying to figure out what is going on here. While we have people, you tell people starving in the streets and dropping dead in Russia, you're essentially having that happen in the United States. The fourth leading driver of death in the United States is poverty. What are we doing?
Well, that's right. Dr. King talked about the triplets, huh? Racism, materialism, and
Militarism.
militarism.
Mm-hmm.
So it all, redounds to the detriment of all people, especially poor people. And my only thought is that we really have to point out what's going on here. And what's going on here is in large part all racism.
Really?
Do you think that we would be acting against the Palestinians in the way we are if they look like us? Do you remember when Ukrainians were refugees in Europe and they were welcomed with open arms in countries that wouldn't give the Syrians the time of day?
Mm-hmm.
I was in Germany when Angela Merkel, to her credit, accepted thousands of Syrians. They were welcomed. We saw this on the railroad stations and so forth, but not well. The Germans made an exception. Most of the others are rejecting refugees, even though the West is largely responsible for the refugees. So I don't know. In Gaza, if you look at the persecution of the Palestinians, that has a racist character to it. And I remember James Baldwin writing to Angela
Davis.
Davis.
Mm-hmm.
And saying, "Look, Angela, they put you on the cover of Newsweek, chained, because they got you. You got to realize, Angela, that as long as the white supremacists can work their will in our government, they will inflict all kinds of damage and death on people who don't look like us." So that would be one thing that Black people, African Americans, are uniquely equipped to make a point of, and I would hold the various candidates' feet to the fire on that. One last thing: how about our volunteer army?
Mm.
Now we know that that's a poverty draft, isn't it? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people need 3 square meals. People need a chance to get an education. You put in your 20 years. If you survive, well, you can retire when you're 40 or whatever. Um, that's not right, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone should bear the responsibility for defending our country. And if the situation today were like it was in Vietnam, where even Congress people had to serve, well,
Mm-hmm.
Congress people came back and said, this is crazy. We got to shut this down, and it was, but far too late. So that would be one thing that we could militate for. But it's so distressing that there are these only 2 candidates. I'd like to get away from this 2 candidate, this choice between uh, pest and cholera, and try to figure out how. One person has suggested that if I traditionally vote Democrat, which I have up until 2016, I voted for Jill Stein then. If I vote Democrat, then I find a person who's going to vote for Trump, and I say, okay, look, here's the deal. If you don't vote, I won't vote. Now, if that took hold over the whole country, my God, a third party candidate like Jill Stein might have a chance. But the way the system is built now, people who, like us, people who need a decent share of the wealth, people who need to have a decent job and a place to sleep, we're going to be exploited forever unless we stand up for our rights.
Reverend Dr. Uri, I want to give you all a couple of minutes apiece to make a comment or ask Ray McGovern a question. And you are a veteran. in addition to, he is one part of the national leadership team of Rainbow Push. He's also a lawyer, pastor of one of the iconic Black churches in the United States. Your thoughts, Reverend Dr. Uri?
Well, Mr. McGovern, thank you for your explanation of the framework of what's going on in Ukraine. I want to go back to Anastasi's question about why it matters, and I think it's important that we put the context of what's happening here in two categories. One is geography, right? The other is a matter of history. So if we look at what Ukraine actually contributes to the world economy, there's a significant percentage of grain that is created or grown in Ukraine and then exported. What you also have in the midst of global warming is the expansion of the potential for famine in certain parts of the world. And so now you have a challenge, the issue, the backdrop, not just this kind of nominal geopolitical issue between Ukraine and Russia. It really is about land domination, right? So you have who's going to control land over and against NATO's eastern expansion. But also, let's be real clear: the coast of the Ukraine is on the Black Sea. The other part is when we think about what's happening in Palestine, you have the Suez Canal. That has to do a lot with the shipment and movement of goods and trade in the most efficient way possible over waterways and seaways. And so at the undercurrent in all of this that's not often spoken of is, on one hand, you're trying to have control of land against the interests of what looks like a different model of colonization of national interests to be able to channel them. You've got Russia defending its part, you've got NATO trying to expand, and you've got the independent smaller countries trying to figure out, do we join? You have a similar sort of thing going on with China over Taiwan. Everybody, particularly amongst the superpower class, is trying to figure out, how do we either control land or influence the control of land? And the land we're trying to control very often has a lot to do with how do goods move in terms of the global economy. And so that's not often talked about as the economic underpinnings of why there is a war or a concern amongst any demographic group in the United States in the first place. It is because in the midst of what we are looking at in terms of an almost certain famine that's going to hit certain parts of the world, maybe even parts of the United States, the flow of grain, the ability to sustain and feed oneself and move goods efficiently, that has to be placed in its proper historical context, not just in this kind of detached, oh, Russia. The soundbite from national media is Russia is invading Ukraine because Russia don't like Ukraine. No. Let's be really, really clear. It's not about like or dislike. At the end of it, you do not put military effort behind kind of cordialities between government. That's not why you fight wars. That's not why the what we call the Berlin Conference took place. It was to control resources, and the resources that you claimed, you had to be able to defend by the basis of military power to be able to lay claim. We saw the experiment on the continent of Africa. We're seeing it play out in a different kind of geospatial, geopolitical space in this process. And the war is following the intent, because after the war, the real question is not only who's going to win the war, who's going to control the land. That is what is at stake. And I think when we think about the geopolitics and how it affects not just Blacks in America, but when we look at the effects on the global family,
Unity. That's
to
right.
Dr. King's point, that's the issue that we've got to wrestle with, and that's the issue we've got to pay attention to.
Well, land and water, right?
Land and water, and land and water rights,
Absolutely.
right? Not just land and water rights, land and water rights. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, I wish I could get to you, Attorney Daryl Jones, but I only have about 2.5 minutes here, and I do want Ray McGovern to kind of, because you've really helped to frame this for us, because so many people are trying to figure out what is going on here. What is going on? And so much of our money is going to this. And Americans, as we are living in so much want and need and more destitution, we need to know what really is going on, what's happening up here, not just what's being poured into our ear. The last couple of minutes belong to you, Ray McGovern.
Well, thank you. No, thank you very much for your comments. I think they are overwhelmingly right in terms of the broad picture. When you come down to Ukraine and Russia, you know that Ukraine has the Black Earth. I've never seen such fertile land. I've been there. You dig your trowel down and you go about 6 feet of Black Earth. It's Hitler, as you probably know, loaded up trains with the Black Earth, brought it back to Germany. So the land is very important. In the Ukraine-Russia context, Russia has a bumper harvest every year. Russia is exporting more wheat than anyone these days, and to China and to everywhere else. Russia doesn't need the Black Earth in Ukraine. In Russia's view, it's purely a defensive measure to make sure that middle-range nuclear weapons are not put in Ukraine, as President Biden personally promised Putin on the 30th of December, 2021, not to do. In other words, Ukraine is a strategic threat. Who's going to own that stuff that stays in Ukraine? Monsanto, Cargill. They already have the rights to lots of that land, bought through that corrupt fellow Zelensky. So land is really important. And what I think here is what I've called Ukraine is the mother of all opportunity costs, okay? Because the more we divert our attention from things such as you have mentioned, things like the environment, things that we have to cooperate on, hunger, there is going to be lots of hunger more. So it's the mother of all opportunity costs because it costs all this money and all this attention and neglects the people that don't matter, the people in the third world who will be subjected to such hunger that they will have to be traveling or trying to get to the first world behind our gated communities. I'm not suggesting we have gated communities, but lots of people do, and lots of people make a lot of dough out of this war and will continue to make lots of dough if Ukraine is able to keep these fields that Monsanto and Cargill now own.
First time we've heard that, but heaven knows that's what it is. Attorney Darrell Jones, Reverend Dr. Todd Urey, Attorney Anastasia Sanat, we thank you for participating in this conversation, this very special conversation with the iconic patriot, Ray McGovern. We just thank you for your service and for your willingness to lay it all on the line today for truth, to make America, in fact, in reality, what it is on paper. Thank you for all of the work that you've done down through the years and all that you continue to do when you're supposed to be in retirement. You should not retire. Go to raymcgovern.com, everybody. He's got fantastic videos where he breaks down these issues. raymcgovern.com. You don't want to miss it. Sending you so much love, you and your wife and your family.
Thanks, all. Good to be with you.
God bless you and thank you. AM 950 Radio, the San